Could everyone just, well, more of you, could you turn off your cameras? Because our internet isn't that strong, I think. And there's a lot of people on the call, so because of that. Right, and before starting my speech, I'd just like to take some time to appreciate, because seeing we're the only offline on-site team in this ESL final, I'd just like to take the moment and appreciate all of the supporting staff on site. So the conveners, the orgcom, the committee, the tab team. I think all of you guys were tremendous. I think that organizing like an international tournament is, difficult at its best, but like in the middle of a pandemic, I think it's a monstrous task. And I just want to say thank you that you made this happen. I think me and Drok really enjoyed it, and I think everyone else also enjoyed it a lot. So we really appreciate you guys doing this. It was a wonderful experience. Okay, now to the debate. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel recognize. Reincarnation happens on both sides of the house, which is to say, in both worlds are people, reincarnated between different lives, i.e. being born in a certain life, for instance, of a different gender or a different race or different ethnicity. We think these are things which, change depending on the cultural context in this debate. The comparative, therefore, is where do people, more likely strive for beneficial social change? We think the opposite. On both sides of the house, the people have the incentive to, strive for social change, to improve the well-being of all social groups, seeing as they might well become one of them, i.e. becoming, in one life, you're the dominant social group with, a lot of social power. It's likely that in another life, you're reincarnated as a, oppressed minority, i.e. African Americans or LGBT minority. Hence, both sides of the house, get the impact of people wanting to improve it for all groups. However, exclusively on opening on OG, on government, you have the benefit of people having a better understanding. So bear this comparative and metric in mind. The question is, where do people more effectively are able to engage in improving the lives for everyone? Also, 2 points in the framing of our world. We think this change, remembering past lives happens gradually for 2 reasons. Because 1, we don't want people, are unlikely to be overwhelmed by all of that. And 2, we think that adulthood is a very vague term, it's subjective how fast you develop, etc. So I think it's fair of us to say that it happens gradually. But secondly, remember that, how would we see this happening? We see this happening as, just like old people remember their lives in their 20s. They don't remember every single detail, but they remember the general, feelings and how they behaved, what they felt, etc. We think this is analogous to how we would remember reincarnation, as if we were old people looking back on our lives. Hence, the comparative is, where do we more effectively are able to engage and improve the well-being of the oppressed and vulnerable social groups? We bring you 2 arguments. Firstly, on why we have better empathy and understanding, therefore more likely to effectively mobilize for concrete changes, and secondly, how we improve the self-actualization. But before that, CEO.
Right. Given that the motion says both traits and preferences, could you clarify why this changes what type of person you're likely to be on your side of the debate?
Right. We think that, as the motion states, there are certain things to you which are intrinsic, i.e. your personality or how you behave, things like that. We think what changes is the cultural context, which is like dependent and contingent, i.e. which city you were born in, which country you were born in, what kind of a parents you had, how you look like. All of these things we think are contingent. What we don't think is contingent is, your soul, your, intrinsic properties, which are immutable. First argument, why this fosters better empathy and understanding in 2 layers of analysis. 1, recognize that humans, we largely live, in a way, solitary lives, which is to say that our experiences are largely radically different from those of our compatriots, which is to say, because of the difference, cognition and cognitive apparatuses, but also, different properties of how, we were brought up, how we live, how we go about our lives, can, people never really truly understand one another, i.e. I can never understand really truly the plight of people who, are oppressed in different ways than I am, because we simply share a radically different experience of our world, and therefore, our struggles are radically different and cannot be, cannot be driven down to a common denominator. Hence, we say I cannot really understand the plight of a black person who suffers racism on a daily basis, or a member of an LGBT minority being discriminated radically day by day. We think these are things which you cannot understand, if you haven't experienced them firsthand. Why? Because 1, it's unlikely that you can just simply by abstract thought or analysis are able to truly deduce what was happening. We think that on a comparative, lived experiences, how it actually felt, how it actually went down, far trumps any, ability to, deduct the circumstances or analyze them abstractly. Hence, we have the unique benefit of being able to understand radically more on our side of the house, how people, are oppressed in different ways, how the structures of oppression function, and how we can mitigate them. But secondly, you're more likely to recognize the arbitrariness of social roles. Given that the motion presumed that, this reincarnation has been going on for centuries, you're more likely to, think back on the different social contexts and how people were, placed within them. Because recognize that people have, been subjugated in different social structures for millennia. We think that there is a unique and intrinsic property to every human being, which, however, is molded by the specific cultural context you live in. I.e., in the 1800s, it was perfectly normal for people to, think of Black people as, an inferior race or whatnot. However, given that, you're more likely on our side of the house to have the synthesis of all experiences, are you more likely to recognize the arbitrariness of these social roles, and you are more likely to evaluate them in a wider context and come to the conclusion, which is the only true conclusion, that deep down we all share a similar human condition. The thing is, that makes us human, that makes all of us the same. We're more likely to get it on our side of the house. What's the impact here? Three of them. One, you're more likely to truly understand oppression and the mechanisms in which it works. Secondly, because of that, you're more able to effectively engage in countering that oppression. I.e., if you have lived experience of oppression, you're more likely to know the mechanisms which help it, which is comparatively way better than, trying to be an ally, but you can't really, go there to the fullest extent. Thirdly, you're more likely to, be aware of these issues, which you weren't prior even aware of them before because you haven't experienced them. All in all, we get more benefits for the currently disenfranchised social groups. All of them, the poor, the minorities, racial, ethnic, religious, people who are most disenfranchised are get most benefits out of the house, which we think is most important because currently they're the ones who, aren't able to exercise the full potential of their being, which is why we get that far better. The second argument, why self-actualization is more likely to happen, why it's beneficial, on two layers. One, you're more likely to know where your strengths lie and where, your strong suits are. Because, having lived many lives, you know what you're good at, what you're not as good at, which makes it more likely, from the start to know what you should focus on and not, waste your time, as it were, going on paths which don't, fulfill you emotionally or, intellectually in ways that they could have otherwise. Therefore, you're more likely to, live your best life, as it were, because you know what you have to do to be able to, exercise your fullest potential. But secondly, you also don't recreate the mistakes you've done before. Recognize that insofar as time is limited, making mistakes, i.e. hurting other people, hurting yourself, you don't have unlimited time to learn all these things, given that life is finite. Hence, you're more likely to know that from the get-go and not make the mistakes as they happen. Therefore, you're more likely to, one, live the best life for yourself, which I think is a hugely important factor because, all of us are, the stakeholders for self-actualization. And two, you also, get the benefit of trying to do that more effectively.
Thank you very much, the Prime Minister, and it's time for Leader of the Opposition to respond.
Now, can someone confirm that I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Three, two, one. Before I go into our points, why dying is important, and memories dying is important because it actually brings change and the ability to meaningfully choose and change your personality. First, a few points of rebuttal to OG about the societal shift. Note that at the status quo, just being born 20 years later without having memories of what LGBTQ people went through in the past, current Gen Z generation is much more accepting of LGBTQ people just because they were born in a different era. Note that we are able to have progress in the status quo as well. You're much less likely on their side of the house to be able to accept all the new stuff that hits you at the point where you are at a conflict with your past self. Meaning that if you were, for example, a privileged person in your past and have oppressed other people, in the status quo, you're probably not going to be like, oh yeah, I was a really bad person, I oppressed so many people. You're more likely to rationalize your choices in a way that you say, I wasn't as bad, or I was forced to do these things, or I couldn't have chosen otherwise. And you are very much less likely to actually be a very big advocate for these changes that OG wants. But note, and this is even worse, if you were an unprivileged person and you are born in this cycle of not having privilege, you are very quickly going to realize that privilege is very hard to gain, and that people who are privileged in that lifetime, once they're born, will make sure that they will get those memories as a retribution for what happened to them in the past, meaning that I know that privilege depends on others not having the same luxury. So you're likely to rationalize those past choices. On our side, we think the knowledge that everyone gets born differently already gives quite a few incentives for people to make sure that having bad experience, etc., that people are going to have good lifetimes in the future, because they know that they might be born somewhere in the future as another person. So we think that these incentives exist, and note that also the status quo incentives exist for society to change. Why memory is dying is important for change and happenings. Note that what makes us happy is the feeling that whatever bad happens in our lifetime, at some point it will stop, or at some point you will be able to make better choices, or that you will at least be freed of it. Note that your choices are highly constricted by your surrounding, meaning that it is often not directly your choosing of what kind of personality, etc., you have in the status quo, or in that on our side of things. In what kind of society you grow up, what is normalized, all the things that they talk about, what kind of if you're allowed to be a sexist, etc., is all defined by society. So being inherently stubborn is a trait that can show in very different ways over a different era. But note what changes is that the amount of emotional stress to know that you will never be able to forget what you did, that you will never be able to start over, is an extreme emotional harm. If I personally could choose one thing to happen in my lifetime, is that to know that I will be able to forget the abuse that I have experienced, because it significantly destroyed my ability to meaningfully form my personality and make choices because it happened. And note, on their side of the house, they have to stand for a person remembering all the shitty things that happened to them. Note that people necessarily remember bad things much more intrinsically than they remember positive things. First of all, because our brain is wired in a way to alert us of danger, meaning that evolutionary, it was much more important to run away from threat or know that that fire is hot, and to learn that very quickly, rather than it is to eat something nice or to have a good relationship, meaning that these memories will be much more prevalent. Note that also the brain and people have also self-protection mechanisms that protect them from being able to access these memories in a positive way. Meaning, when you have experienced trauma, when you have experienced bad things, what the brain does, it makes you dissociate. It makes you basically exist in your shell without being able to address this. And note, a very, very important thing is that you do not inherit the skills when you reach adulthood. And note that dealing with emotions, dealing with trauma, dealing with all these kind of things, being able to verbalize how you feel, being able to even pay for therapy or whatever, is reliant on you having gained skills to be able to do that. And note that they don't have this on their side of the house. So the one thing that they can actually give people to be happier is for them to be able to forget and able to actually make significant choices for themselves. Before I continue, I will take CG.
Would you rather to be born in the age of 30, but with the memory of a child in 0 years, or with having your memory when you're 30? Why?
Honestly, I would rather I just don't remember whatever happened in the past, because so many shitty things happened in the past, and I don't want another lifetime to have to deal with these things. Because look, one lifetime of shitty things is already enough. Another lifetime is just breaking you. Note that the ability to meaningfully choose and change your personality is also restricted by the choices you made in the past, and we actually get less change on their side of the house. Because, as I said, people will identify with their past selves. Note that, one, it is a version of you. Even if that is not you, you don't look the same, or you are not in the same surrounding. It is a version of you that you empathize with, because people have this transcendent feeling of identity. And note that the other thing is that people, from what I've already explained in rebuttal, that you are also trying to protect your past self and the past choices you made, you're much less likely to admit that maybe that girl didn't actually consent the way that you thought it did, or that maybe those jokes were actually problematic, at the point where you actually remember this as choices that you personally made. Because people assume that they then have been good versions or okay versions of themselves, they also get stuck in that, meaning that they're less likely to be able to make very, very different choices. Meaning, notice that being stubborn in an environment, like having an inherent trait in an environment where you are surrounded by people who have different traits, can very, very much differently materialize on our side of the house and on the other side of the house. Note that the expression of inherent traits stays the same. Because people should be able to forget what they did in a past life, please vote OO.
Thank you very much to leader of the opposition, and it's time for DPM to continue the case for opening government.
Point of clarification to answer CEO's POI, what these traits are likely going to be. We say that, I mean, if we take like 7 billion people as on planet right now, take their traits, whatever they are, and then in the future they will recycle, and that's how in the future traits will look like. We say that it's likely that people have positive traits, and this is shown by, unless you are in a really bad social conditions, but something externally in the environment affects you, you're likely to be a good person in the life. This is also shown that sentencing, when you have no conditions that would alleviate you, is much harsher. Now, firstly, I will respond to OO, I think in 3 different points. They bring a very strong argument, I believe, on how people are going to have some bad experience that they will never be able to erase. And I think that this is a hit that, to an extent, we and OG needs to take in order that we have the benefits that we want to have in our first argument. However, we still have a couple of responses. One, the negative experience that you had in the past lives, they are to an extent going to be relativized, right? So even you had a really shitty experience in one life, it's highly likely that this didn't happen in the maximum number of lives in the past. So therefore, it's unlikely they're going to be so emotionally stressed because of that negative experience. Still, it will be hurtful for you, but it's likely that the harm is not going to be of the size that OO wants to have. Secondly, I think that now, when we have such a world, it's likely that people are going to face similar issues, right? Everyone will have issues on how we can save, how we can cope with the experiences of the past. So it's not more likely that structures will develop where you'll be able to handle those issues, right? You'll be able to talk to all the people. This will be something that is faced with everyone. So likely to gain support and improve your own self-conditions, right? I mean, often issues such as, I don't know, specific kind of discrimination or specific actions that have happened to you are negative. Many people find it very difficult to cope with it because they don't have no one to talk to. Now this is changed because everyone is likely to face because of some issues. Thirdly, we say that, okay, even if in the past bad things were happening, it's likely that it will be better in the future. Why? Because now you have a really strong incentive that you make sure that in the future this thing does not happen. And you also have, I mean, always try to say that the incentive is same on both words, but we have the better capacity. And this is what Philip talks about in his argument. Like, you went through some oppressive structures, you know exactly what the structures are, how specific kind of oppressions happens, who has power in the society. You also know what kind of solutions work, what kind of solutions don't work, like both in terms of policy, how the society reacts, but also how you individually can cope. And I think that this makes us way better so that we can cope with certain issues, right? If you never experienced climate change on your skin, you're much more difficult to understand the issue, the problem. If you never experienced racism, I mean, how can you go to then develop policy and how to save racism? In other words, it's likely that you have experienced those issues, a wide diversity of them, and therefore you're likely able to solve them, right? But even if you like relativize those issues, right? So using the rebuttal I used to OO, I mean, still you gain the knowledge. Often the patterns of oppression are to a certain extent similar, right? There's certain power structures that are there, and you need to do something in order to liberate individuals. Unfortunately, and this is a bit more creative, we say that it's less likely that the oppressive stuff has happened to you in the past in your world. Why? Because, I mean, you don't have that much of an incentive to push for oppressive policies in our world. So second point of rebuttal to OO on how you're now born, how there is going to be less acceptance for certain progressive social issues because you have the memories of the past oppressive eras that are harmful for you. So we have two responses to that. Firstly, like if you were born really in a better era, you went through at least 18 years of that. So you're more likely to, already buy into the progressiveness of the period. And when the memories come after you, like they come to you slowly, like in a year or two, because adulthood doesn't happen instantly, then it's highly unlikely that you're going to suddenly become a racist or whatever, particularly because it's highly unlikely that you were only a part of the dominant social group in all of your past lives. And secondly, we don't say that history without having this experience with these memories from the past is necessarily positive, right? I mean, LGBT situation worsened greatly in the beginning of the 20th century. Also in the past, there was in specific social groups more acceptance toward them, for example, Roma people, as it is now in these times. So opposition needs to prove that on the net, history is actually getting better. And the third point of rebuttal to opposition, when they essentially talk about rationalization, how you're more likely to rationalize that you did some kind of oppression, we say, I mean, we don't see the mechanism on how this happens, right? Because also you were oppressed for some time, and then like, why would you just rationalize the oppressor part? And then we have like two extra responses. One, it's more likely that you were born oppressed than the oppressor. Why? Because there's numerically more of the oppressed, right? That's literally the definition of it. And if you look into the history, right, the slaves, plebs, and a few patricians, the capitalist class, and the proletariat, it's highly likely that you were born the one who was oppressed, so you know the social structures. And secondly, oppression is intersectional, right? Even if you were privileged in one certain aspect, I don't know, you were rich, but maybe you were a rich woman, so you did face some kind of oppression. And since patterns of oppression are in many cases the same, it's more likely that you will gain some of the benefits that can help you then change things. I will take a point from CEO now.
What is the difference between sleep and death?
I think this is quite obvious, right? From sleep, you wake up. From death, you do not wake up. Okay. I don't know why POI was needed for that. Now, I mean, to bring up Philip's material, which was to a large extent unengaged with by opening opposition, I mean, this is really the strongest material that can happen this round. Why? Because firstly, we show you that incentives for improving progress are the same on both sides, but we show you that we have more capacity to do that in our world, right? Because you know more, you know the solutions, you know the experiences, and then you can strive to improve things for the better. Other people around you feel the same. So this means that in the future, you're going to have the maximum benefit for all the people. And secondly, an argument that is more simple, more naive, but I think also an extremely important one, right? On an individual level, if you know what are you good at, what are you bad at, then you're more likely, and also if you know like what kind of solutions work for you in personal life, you're more likely to self-actualize in the life and to do better, right? You're still going to have 18 years without that experience, so you can experiment, you can try a lot of things, you can be like, you can try many different areas, right? Focus on everything, but after some time, you will get the feedback, right? What might work or you might not. You might still decide otherwise, but you have much more capacity to decide. You have greater agency because you have more knowledge. Because of all those reasons, go with OG.
Thank you very much to DPM, and it's time for Diallo to close the debate on the top row.
Can you please confirm that I'm audible?
Yeah, all good.
Thanks. Sorry, just a second. Panel, 2 points in my speech. First, why memories of our past selves are our own identity and are going to continue being our own identity also under government. And secondly, why they're infringing on many people's, if not everyone's, ability to meaningfully choose and self-actualize. And this assault on human dignity is not something that can be traded off for a bit more pretended empathy. Before that, a lot of rebuttal, because OG seems to say, well, support structures would develop if everyone would remember their past trauma. But one, even if that's like, if they were true, then we would see a lot more support for victims right now, rather than shaming and just trying to advise people to be tough and push things under the rug. But also, secondly, even if that were true, it takes years to process trauma. It's years of pain that changes who you are. That is not something you can just say, oh, well, you'll go to a support meeting, then it's fine. But also, just on the idea of so they're clever, right? They say most people have been oppressed throughout history. So that probably means that the majority of people would be born with some sort of memory of having been oppressed in the past. One, they themselves say that it is going to be relativized through current filter, right? So you're probably going to lose the rational ability to label it that they want, right? So you're probably going to lose the, what was done to me is racism. What I am doing now is also racism. I should stop because I know it's bad, right? You're probably, however, only going to remember the hurt, the pain, and the shame, because those are the things that are visceral. Those are the things that you remember from your childhood, even if I can't remember even what I had for lunch last week, right? But also, if you look at how people cope with trauma, you would realize that very often people who were bullied in the past cope by becoming the biggest bully to make sure that doesn't happen to them again, right? Very often oppressing others is a self-defense mechanism and a coping mechanism of people who are oppressed in some way. And if their analysis on intersectionality of if I've been oppressed in any way in the past, that means I will never oppress someone were true, then numerically it would mean very few people would be oppressors in the status quo, which is simply untrue. That would mean women could never be racist because they've experienced patriarchy. It could mean Black women can never be homophobic. And that's obviously blatantly true. I'd love this empathy analysis of OG to be true, because it would mean the world in the status quo would also be better, but it simply isn't. I think the problem with remembering things that were done in the past from less progressive times means that you make change slower. If you look at the status quo, would prevent society from becoming more progressive faster is not the fact that young people aren't motivated enough. It's the fact that old people are afraid to, it's not even that they're afraid because they do it consciously, right? But their past selves were racist. So they're not able to accept that that was racism or that was bad, because they would mean that they would have to deal with the fact that they maybe were evil people in the past and they don't want to do that, right? So if you see that in the status quo, already memories of past selves being oppressive to others is what prevents change, I'm not sure why you want to put more of it in the world, right? But just the idea on people never truly understand one another, like it's probably still going to be true to a large extent, because people don't even truly understand themselves most of the times. And carrying trauma without the coping skills is just insanely oppressive to you on every level of your being. It affects your ability to get out of bed in the morning. It affects your ability to get out of the street. It affects your ability to strike up a conversation with a stranger. It affects pretty much everything you do. I don't think this can be overstated in this debate. Do not let government to just say, well, you will give you support groups and then you'll process it. And also if you process it in a different life, you maybe will remember that, right? Because Marina has explained to you, remember the viscerality of feelings, because we are programmed to remember the danger and to feel the danger to avoid it, but you don't carry the skills that you have developed to cope. That is crucial. Like, I will deal with the idea of improved self-actualization because I think it's nonsense. I think you're clearly limiting it. But I mean, just to preempt CG, they can't knife OG, who says clearly that all will remember how old people remember, like general feelings and fuzziness. But also, even if CG can somehow work around that, I don't remember everything I did last week, and I've been alive for 25 years, right? Just take 80 years worth of memories and multiply that by I don't know how many lives. Clearly, you will only remember bits and fragments, and you will remember the most visceral ones. Those are likely the ones likely to be the traumatic ones. I don't remember every one of the 100 debates I've won or of the useful feedback I've gotten. I remember the 2 times judges have been so oppressive to me and so mean to me that it made me cry, and that is what drives me to become a better speaker. I know it's not healthy, but it's simply how people process. Why are memories of our past selves our own identity? Because even when we feel shame and guilt about what we've done in the past and we want to change, there's a difference between wanting to change the action and being able to change. Because just because I change how I act in a moment doesn't mean that I've changed my identity. It's why it's so hard to start going to the gym when you decide to do it. You do it once or twice, but you still think of yourself as the person who doesn't go to the gym and who struggles with it. So it is a struggle, and so you're less likely to do it. That is also why you see a lot of people who grew up in very unfortunate circumstances find themselves in domestic abuse patterns mirroring their childhood, not because they don't know how shit it is, not because they don't want to avoid it, but because that is how they see themselves, and because we seek patterns around us that mirror what we know. And also just on the idea that people will justify and rationalize things they've done because they don't want to believe that they are evil themselves. So that probably means that regardless of whether it is true that we know we were bad people in the past, we will definitely not see it as we are evil people and we need to change. Our ego will do our best to prevent that. I will now take closing.
Yeah, why do most old people feel good with their lives at the end of their life?
So many reasons why old people feel good about themselves at the end of their lives. But I think the biggest part of it is because they rationalize the things they have been through, because most of them have had, on average, pretty shitty lives. There's been a lot of struggle, especially people who, weren't born in the capitalistic boom in middle high class, and they are still able to make something of it. It's probably because, as I'm telling you, experiences mean less objectively, and they mean the meaning that you ascribe to them. So if you look at the studies on cognitive changes right now, personality and preferences don't make you who you are, right? You're conditioned by memories and learned behaviors and patterns, and by the meaning you assign to things, right? That is why different people with same personality end up with completely different lives. Some end up sociopaths, and some end up like serial killers, and some end up leading, top companies, revolutionizing the world, right? People get stuck in old patterns very easily. I've already explained to you why remembering something as my past self, I will probably adopt it into my identity, because otherwise my ego would be severely hurt and I would need a lot of skills to deal with that, which I don't have because I don't carry those with me, right? But also why people who have experienced abuse in the past are permanently stuck having to relive and re-overcome that abuse over and over. Even if the government can get away with saying that those traumatized people reliving it make the world better, I'm unsure why that justifies forcing the people who have already been through trauma once, forcing them to relive it. But secondly, I have no idea why it's worth restricting the ability of people to make choices for themselves in the present tense. I am very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to the yellow and to the top house so far. It's time to open the bottom half of this debate and invite member of the government to continue.
Hi. Three, two, one. I think that we gain most in this debate when we live in this sort of world is wisdom and happiness that it provides. I'll talk how we get to happiness, why you're more happy and fulfilled as a person in any case that happens in this debate, and why we help more the weak rebuilding the points that were taken off OG and winning that case as well. Before that, one major point of rebuttal to CO, who tell us that hurt people, right? That the trauma is cyclical and people hurt other people's in life, and people carry their trauma throughout their lives. Their case is dependent on a person experiencing trauma, not coping with it at all during their life, and then moving on with that, or maybe developing some coping skills, but losing them. But know that having coping skills, like developing them over your life, actually means emotional reconciliation. Like that's what it actually means. It means you take your trauma into account, but you're able to come up to catharsis with that, able to heal your psyche from that and move on with your life, as OO concede most people are able to do in their life, right? With their response to our POI. Know that you also have an inherent interest to do that, because carrying your trauma throughout your life is massively detrimental to you. Most people want to do that way. Most people will find some sort of psychological mechanism to come to terms with their trauma, to make it sting less. That happens in our world, and that world, that will happen even more strongly the more distant that trauma is. I think that most people succeeding doing that, that will happen happen to us as well. How do we achieve happiness? You achieve happiness when you're happy with what you have, when you set reasonable, achievable goal for yourself, and when you have strong interpersonal connections with the people in your life, when you don't push them away and you engage with your community. Why then are you more happy in our world? Note the harder case for us. If you land in a reincarnation that is worse off than a previous one that was really privileged and you have a really happy life and now you're suffering, that's the strongest case for side up. You don't blame yourself now because you know that the previous success was a result of privileged life circumstances, that you don't try to break your back achieving things that you couldn't have achieved otherwise because you know how your previous life turned out, how it rolled out, why you succeeded when you succeeded and why you didn't succeed. Now you're able to compare this and not blame yourself for lack of success. Also, you feel massively comforted by knowing that your future will be happier. That means that you have more happiness than frustration and sadness in the comparative, because we see that in our world, in the status quo, people in really hard life circumstances create a lot of comfort from themselves from only having faith in a heaven, in the next world, will they have better off life. Now you have a certainty because you know that already happened to you, so that might as well happen again. You know you experienced that death, and you have an equal chance of doing that again. What's the opposite? When you're in a better off reincarnation than you had before, you can appreciate what you have even more because you understand that it's fleeting. Like the song says, you only know what you got till it's gone. Now you experience it being gone. You know what you have right now, and you're more present in every moment in your interactions with your family, in your interactions with your friend, in having the little small things in life. You take so much more pleasure and happiness and the comparative. Not that the comparative of off-world is highly frustrating, because in each happy moment that you have, you'll know that you'll forget that completely. You won't carry that with you, and you won't be happy with that. But that also means that in our version of the world, you use the opportunity that you have to gain experiences, to gain wisdom, to gain feelings that you'll carry on throughout your next lives. That means that you even feel more secure in that life for the next reincarnation, because again, the comparative of upside is you know something bad might happen to you, and you fear that because you have no control of it at all. In our world, you can gain wisdom, you can gain experiences, even not like practical hand skills, but you know more stuff happens, how things operate in the world, and you know you'll be better off because you'll have that understanding, the comparative understanding of how the world works that a 30-year-old has, that is way stronger than a 0-year-old have. That means that you have more happiness than fear over the future of trauma. It's obviously why you're happier now, because you have an easier life, but also you remember more positive memories than negative memories, directly engaging with OO there. But before I do that, CO.
Gil, as the info says, you still know and don't dispute the fact that you'll be reincarnated. That means you're very unlikely to support positions like redlining that you know could fuck future you.
Fine, I'm not right now talking about like the political thing, although we'll get to that in a minute, why that's better on our side. Only on the personal happiness thing so far that doesn't dispute that. Why do you have more positive than negative memories? It's a psychological defense mechanism. You prefer to remember the positive things because you want to believe that your life is generally happy, because even if they're hard, the belief that they're hard makes them even more hard. And the more harder your life is, so do positive memories shine out more the brighter. It's really unlikely that singular traumas will have the same weight for all the reasons that OG already analyzed, the different body, the different life circumstances. You're not surrounded by the same people, which means that over the decades, even that trauma is likely to go away. Note, as I've said, people in the status quo manage to do that, and we think that the answers that we get to, even from the LO to the POI, doesn't actually represent the doom and gloom that everybody, like the doom and gloom that we get from that answer to the POI, we don't think is representative of the normal person. Why do we get more help to the weak in society? We think that OG started by pointing out that we have more compassion, but not why it's so important politically. Why? Because it influences your political ideology through that moral. Note that political ideology comes from your moral ideology, which is emotional. If harming the weak makes you angry, you're likely to be socially left. If lack of loyalty to or makes you angry, you'll be politically right. If you want to feel comforted by power structures, you'll be politically right. If lack of fairness means to you not everybody gets the same thing, you'll be politically left. If people get not what they deserve, it angers you, you'll be politically right. That means that in our world, people that felt that they suffered more, feel more powerfully about compassion, about wanting to help other people because they remember the pain, as OO say. That means that we have more compromises. Why is that more important? Because that means we're not dependent on the fact that everybody remembers being like an oppressed Black guy. We simply need to have slightly more people in the centers of power willing to make more compromises, having slightly more consensus decision, being able to make more decision on the basis of some more shared experiences that they all have because they remember these past lives. That is possible because a personality is continuous and not set, which means that we are able, in status quo, we see people changing their personality because they have more wisdom. That is also possible in this world, but only on our side. For those reasons, very proud to propose, and I'm very happy to do that next to Asaf, who really dragged us all the way here and made a fantastic job throughout these past 2 years. Thank you, everybody.
Very much, the member of the government, and it's time to call the member of the opposition to open the case for closing up.
All right. Quickly arranging some last notes. Three, two, one, go. Esteemed panel, 2 extensions from closing opposition that will win us this debate. First of all, we're going to flip this idea of opening government in terms of where we get a more empathetic society that is going to better deal with oppression. We are going to argue that specifically it is more likely on our side at the point at which you do not know your prior life experiences, and I will prove that. Ultimately, therefore, unlocking the kind of empathetical change that they want. And the second case that we're going to bring you is that basically, ultimately, what this policy means on government side is that you die when you become an adult and have a different person superimposed on you, which we think is absolutely dreadful on a principle, simply not defensible. But first, one additional extraneous response on this idea of self-actualization and seeking solutions from previous lives that we heard from opening government and to some extent from closing government. Like, the biggest problem with their analysis on self-actualization is that self-actualization and how we deal with our surroundings and all of that is incredibly inherently tied to our environment that we inhabit, right? At the point at which we draw inspiration from a previous life, we are going to look at solutions that work for a specific context and failures that became failures because of the kind of social environment and physical environment they were in. Notice, however, that we are unlikely to recognize this fundamental difference between the contexts because our mind tends to equivalate things. We try to make sense of patterns. Hence, when we have an experience that seems vaguely familiar for us, our brain will overestimate to what extent it's analogous and will basically is more likely to give us false solutions and be overly falsely instructive in a way that isn't helpful. In the cases where it's helpful, fine, fair enough, we still think that dying is worse. Note that in addition to that, like this kind of equivalence experiences, we've had no real likelihood analysis on like what kind of exactly solutions you fix that are independent of exactly what kind of life you were likely to have led beforehand. Notice that in this motion, we don't have control over who we were beforehand. We don't know how much time they were before us. So the circumstances can be radically different, and we have a particularly harsh amount to which we overestimate our efficacy. But now, first of all, why does the veil of ignorance actually work on opposition side? Notice that when we view others as a black box that you might inhabit in a future life, this is going to be significantly more important than understanding your personal prior lives. Notice that, first of all, this is true for a few reasons. One, oppression in our society constantly shifts in terms of its origins and in terms of how it feels and is experienced, right? This is something that we need to understand, right? Because right now, according to our new social mechanisms in our society, there are people that we haven't oppressed as much in the past that we're likely to oppress. There are new oppressive groups that are going to come, and at the point at which we are trying to understand their suffering on the basis of potential experience that we've had in previous lives, we're not going to understand what they're going through and what they need in order to have their situations fixed. Why? Also because that's socially and culturally dependent on where you are right now. Notice that this basically makes it incredibly unuseful if you have had oppressive experiences in the past, but ultimately they're not going to inform how you're going to deal with them in the future. Notice also just by a numbers game, you're more likely to have been born into a group that is relatively has been more on the side of oppression rather than being oppressed. Numerically, at the point at which it's uncertain who you were, who everyone was, they have to deal with the fact that they may all be be descendants of black people that have been redlined, for instance, right? It's entirely the uncertainty of that, the possibility of having been that in the past and being that in the future is key in order to become more empathetic and drive for more change. And at the point at which you don't superimpose your past experiences of previous lives in order to inform you how oppression feels, that is the point where you're more likely to have to listen to the other person as a black box that you understand that needs to be catered to, because you could be them in the future too. Notice that in addition, so that is basically why ultimately it is better for you to not know who you were in the past. It is more because of those past experiences not being super instructive, and because when we have actually a blank slate of everyone's previous lives, that is the point where we are going to superimpose past oppression experiences, or even just have the majority experiences actually filter through and the negative stuff that opening opposition has talked about. But now to our second case. Look, why do you die as an adult under government side? Notice that basically who you are is what you've experienced and how you've learned to cope with your own environment, with your own social people around you, with your own particularly physical environment. This is who you become over the course of a life. Notice that the opening government pretty much agrees with this. If you have 3 clones and you've let them grow up in entirely different places, they're going to be radically different people, even if they share some traits in common. Notice that therefore these are fundamentally different people in a very fundamentally different timeline, and at the point at which they become adult under government model is where you bit by bit or entirely on within a snap, because like, if I'm being generous, I'm saying that it's gradual. You get a new memories, new experiences, kind of like superimposed on your self, right? What does this mean if you have all of a sudden, when you have these new experiences starting to dictate you and starting to inform you and being incredibly emotionally laden, and your mind having to all fix it in to some extent? We say that is the point where you become a fundamentally different person. This is why we ask the POI what happens. What is the difference between dying and sleep? We don't think that the difference between dying and sleep is just the short and disruption of cognition between this. The difference is waking up with the memories and the kind of and as the product of your experiences that you are, rather than the other one. But before I move on, opening.
Experiences of 80-year-old feminists are extremely valuable. Patterns of oppression are the same. It's just a buzzword to say, different context. No, racism, sexism, social classes, same patterns of oppression.
Being the nature and the kind of racism, even in terms of how they experience it, differs already regionally, right? Being racist or being the victim of racism in Germany is a fundamentally different experience from being in America on the basis of the historical context and the kind of way that it is mirrored to you. At the point at which you, in addition to that, have huge spans of time that might be 100 years, that might be 5 years, might be 20 years. That is the point where where it's going to not be that useful to have to understand the kind of to try to find solutions out of such context, especially as your mind has already tries to frame these things as analogous and will fail to see crucial parts of this. Notice, in addition, that does not engage with new forms of oppression popping up and us not understanding them on the basis of previous lives of anyone, but needing to, but that create the need of us having to listen to these people as a black box for future reference. Notice that what it means when you die is that at the point at which you become a fundamentally different person, that it means every parent loses their children when their children become adults. This means every lover loses the person that they knew and learned to love at the point at which that person gets new memories superimposed. This means that every friend you've ever known and loved, you will have to find a completely different relationship with. We say that this fundamental change of self is not something you can consent to well, and it's something that's going to be devastating. Esteemed panel, proud to stand in opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech, and it's time for the whip speeches, starting with the government whip.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Look, our case is simple, right? Up until now, there is some confusion in this debate. There are 2 big questions of like happiness and oppression, and we're going to win on both of them, right? So my speech is going to be basically why all of humanity is just happier, why this is more important than oppression, and why even if you don't accept this, we also win on oppression. Before I go on to this, I'm going to have 2 points of extraneous rebuttal. First of all, for the death of the self, right? Honestly, I've not proven anything semantically similar to death, right? I've just proven that some of your memories will be erased. Guess what? Every day that you live creates new memories which erase past memories. Honestly, that's not so much of a big of an impact. We don't think that this is too many memories, right? It's highlights from a few decades of life. It's like you have some people that have just better memories than others, and some memories just pop into your head. Honestly, I don't know why this comes at the expense of other memories. But secondly, the impact of this is that it changes your preferences and changes your traits. First of all, note that your personality doesn't change to that extent by the info slide, right? A lot of basic stuff are kept when these memories are recurring. But secondly, obviously, when you live in such a world, you just feel that it's not like a past person that's affecting you. It's a part of yourself, and it actually gives you a better explanation of who you are, who is your personality, what your traits are. Lastly, when they say, well, now you forget all the friends that you have and stuff like that. Yeah, when you're 50, you don't remember the friends that you had in childhood. Again, I don't understand why this is so harmful. Second point of extraneous rebuttal, you say, well, you understand your previous life and oppression just changes throughout society and stuff like that. Well, actually, I'll deal with this later. Sorry. So where do we have more happiness? Opening governments say you're going to do less mistakes. We agree to some extent, but we just show to you much more systematic reasons that prove why people are going to feel so much happier. Because you have long years of perspective, which make every positive event in your life to gain much better meaning, because you know that sometimes it will be gone. As every negative effect is much less dependent on you, because now you understand that in each and every life cycle, you have a big element of luck and a big element of fortune, so you don't blame yourself. The fact that you know that you have hope, even if you're really, really bad and you're just hoping for what's going to happen in your future life. So a lot of situations, asymmetrically, you are just going to feel better. Okay, at this point, we just prove this impact much more likelier than opening government. And CO say, well, how we deal with our environment is related to the environment that we're in. First of all, our case is not dependent on the environment, because the fact that they have good stuff now and they can disappear tomorrow happens in every life cycle. And the fact that you experience more things and that you remember that sometimes you're on top and sometimes you're at bottom just gives you hope regardless. But even if you do accept that this is dependent on your environment, you still understand that there are some factors in your environment that you don't control, and therefore you are still more forgiving. Opening opposition say you are going to remember each and every trauma that you had. This is entirely symmetrical, right? Each and every person, when they're an adult, have stuff that they would rather forget, but most people just learn to deal with it. It's a very natural part of life. Yeah, it takes time, but honestly, most people just know how to do this thing. Secondly, this assumes to a very large extent that most people have a shitty life. We also deal with this and explain why most people just remember positive things, because it's a psychological defense mechanism. Because if your life is really hard, as opening opposition say, then your mind is now going to make the other positive things stick. Because happiness is not something which is singular events and stuff like that. You give meaning to the relationships you have with people, and each person that takes care of you is something meaningful that you take for yourself, and this is something that you're going to remember. Okay, and then okay, that's enough. Why is this more important than the point about repression? First of all, this touches all of the people. It doesn't matter in which position they are, whether they are oppressed, whether they are oppressors. We still win on. Secondly, it applies in more cases, right? Because opening government's case and CO's case as well basically say, well, we want to see political change. I think political change is something that is hard. You need to change a lot of obstacles throughout the way. You need to change parliament and stuff like that. Even if you're not able to change politics, we still apply because people still feel happiness on their day-to-day life. Lastly, the effect of of happiness on your life is all encompassing, right? This is something you experience day to day, your relationships with other people, your own emotions, your own happiness. Therefore, we affect people much more strongly compared to oppression, which we believe that happens. But note, in the modern world, it happens in very rare scenarios where someone is like discriminating against you. This is bad. This is not your feeling of happiness. Before I go on with who should I take? Opening, go.
When my past gets triggered, it's not newer memories, but my grounding and mindfulness skills that bring me back. Why are you legitimate in putting every past victim through this forever, again and again, for eternity? Benefit?
We explained to you why the trauma doesn't pass, because most of the people deal with it, because as you explained, it's really hard to live a life given the trauma. So in your past life, you should have dealt with it to live a normal life. This is what most people would do. This point doesn't stand. So lastly, why is happiness more important than oppression? Because it's like the fact that you had past oppression might affect the future, but note that a lot of instances of oppression are specific to current times, right? There are very few things which are systematic across generations, because most people didn't know about LGBT, and then it was a new concept, and then there was a lot of oppression about it because people didn't relate this to other past forms of oppression. So the question is how much this can actually go. And CO say, well, a lot of people will think they know how the oppression will look like, and they will have to, and they will not listen to people. First of all, if you remember past memories, you will remember people ignoring your own suffering in previous life, and you understand that there are stuff that is different in your life than their life. Secondly, the thing that's most important is to change the inner feeling and how you relate to other people. But lastly, where do we have more oppression? So we think that memories from past lives from the 18th century fade over time. So the question is how much they affect. We respond better to opposition responses when they say ideology doesn't change, because we explain why ideology changes for each and every person in their regular life. And that's why it's also likely that you will be affected. I'm very happy to propose, and I'm really happy to have an amazing partner. The past 2 years have been an amazing journey, and I'm really happy we did it together. I can't imagine it with anyone else.
Thank you very much to Government Whip, and it's time for the last speech of this debate, and I would like to invite the Opposition Whip.
Checking that I'm audible. I presume I am, but...
Yes, you are.
Cool. Then just before I get started, I would first like to thank, obviously, OrCom, CA, everyone for organizing this super fun comp. Also, obviously, would like to thank all my friends and family who are either watching in this room or on the stream. Like, genuinely appreciate all the support and love you're sending our way. And finally, of course, I would like to thank Calix for, you know, just being with me through thick and thin and always like upholding me when I get salty. Cool. Without further ado, then, I would like to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I'm going to just first of all establish that closing government cannot have its cake and eat it too. They can't simultaneously claim that all these memories you're gaining are giving you so much perspective and giving you such insight into the world and reality that it is somehow a significant delta, and then simultaneously say, but you'll only selectively remember one thing or the other. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Either you have a large sum of memories that fundamentally shift who you are, in which case Calix's analysis that explains why your memories are what make you as an individual, your memories are what shape you as an individual human that exists within reality, and then at age 18, you die as per this motion, and a new human being takes your place that is fundamentally and structurally different from you, or you don't get that many memories, and then the delta is not entirely clear to us from what closing government's case says. They can't have it both ways. One or the other needs to be the reality, and they're just not abiding by their bargain. Notice then what top half does. Let's deal with opening government first, because I think opening government does a reasonable job establishing that maybe you'll have some insights into the kind of talents you're likely to have, what you're good at, how to pursue these. Note several things on this. Panel, if you had debated 100 years ago, different arguments would have been useful than they are today. Fuck, if you had debated 15 years ago, you'd have run paradigm shifts. 10 years ago, you'd have run social contract. 5 years ago, you'd have run backlash. And today you would bullshit your way through a state power principle. The fact that you have past memories of what was useful mechanisms of training back in the day does not not mean it is better to have that memory than using modern training techniques. If you were a gymnastics trainer today, you would have access to better training techniques than you did 50 years ago, because we have more understanding and society has advanced, meaning that under the mechanism of you having a good understanding of where your life is like better is probably and like how to better train is probably not that likely to be true. Noting what you're good at is something you're likely going to be able to assess anyways, because you're living your life, you understand what you're good at. You might have also gotten it wrong in a previous life. We're not entirely certain why that's necessarily true. Opening government would like to disagree.
If you went through a plethora of different oppressions, you're way more likely to identify abstract solutions than on comparative, on your side, you read one article on how women are oppressed.
No, because see that your mechanism is only dependent on empathy, not having lived the experience. Calix explains to you why within our world, regardless of which side you're on, and more so on our side of the house, you exist under a veil of ignorance, whereby you imagine yourself to be existing in the future, potentially as any of these individuals anyways. The mechanism of empathy, therefore, because you know and believe it to be factually accurate that you will be reincarnated anyways, means that you already are very likely to impose yourself onto those people anyways. Top Half in general has a problem where both opening government and opening opposition flip a coin on what your experiences are. Opening government says, you're very likely to have faced oppression, therefore you're more likely to have empathy. Opening opposition says you're very likely to have faced oppression, therefore you're likely to be so traumatized that you're likely to be to experience apathy. We say that on our side of the house, regardless of what your experiences from previous lives are or would be in a hypothetical, on our side of the house, you're definitely likely to have the empathy mechanism, specifically because you still understand that you will be reincarnated. Meaning if you didn't have experiences of oppression, if you didn't have experiences that are the prerequisite for empathy, then under opening government logic, you wouldn't have the empathy in the first place. We explain to you that the empathy is not contingent on having the experiences, but rather having the ability to think yourself into the position of another human being. That's what empathy means by definition. It's not having empathy with a victim of a crime. You must have experienced the crime. It is empathize with them because you can place yourself in that position. When you can actively and explicitly imagine yourself being them anyways, then empathy is greater on our side of the house. Notice that if you have past experiences and you didn't experience anything, then you're very likely to think, well, fuck it, probably not so much. Closing would like to disagree.
The best case for CO is that empathy is symmetric. Given all the difficulties of changing society in the first place, the increased happiness of people that we give you is the strongest case that is still standing in this debate and hasn't been engaged with yet.
Notice several things on that. We are unclear on why you're more likely to be happy in the first place. They say, you have like that you have like all of these previous amounts of lifetimes of like experience and access to like emotional fulfillment. As that doesn't even stand to opening opposition already pointing out to you that like you're just as likely to have a lifetime of unhappiness and equally terrible lifetimes. It is not clear to us why you're particularly likely, especially given that they themselves point out you might not have all your memories and all that stuff. I'm not entirely clear on why that's true. At best, your case is symmetrical and a wash. Notice then, however, that what's more important than any of that is what Calix actually then explains to you in the secondary layer, which is irrespectively true of whether or not we have more societal change or not. And that is that pure and simply, you as an individual cease to exist at the point at which you turn 18. Let me make it very clear to you so that there's just no question left at the point. When you grow up, you experience certain things. You interact with other human beings. They shape you. You shape them. You experience new things that then make you make different life choices. You may experience trauma. You may experience nice stuff. You may experience harm. You may experience benefits. Notice that these things, as both government teams concede, shape you as a human being and make you into a different human being. It is therefore not your traits and personality primarily that make you who you are, but it is your experiences and your memories. Once you turn 18, a flip switches and suddenly you are no longer that human being. It is not the same as falling asleep and waking up another human being. It is the same and morally equivalent to dying. We think that death is objectively bad, and Calix gives you several mechanisms because we concede that, like, biologically speaking, of course, you continue to exist, but the individual that existed up until then stops to exist. Everything and everyone you know and love, everyone you have met in history, and everyone you may have loved in previous lives becomes becomes and is structurally inaccessible to you because they all died back then. Everyone you have known all of your life is suddenly fundamentally alien to you because the human being you are today is no longer the same human being. This is a unique kind of dread that you experience within your existence that government side just can't get to fiat out. Because notice that even if happiness is symmetric, and even if like political change is symmetric on both sides of the debate, on our side of the debate, every 18-year-old dies as who they are as individuals. This is the comparative in this debate, and this is a significantly larger impact, and is true regardless of what memories you retain, what memories you take in, what memories shape you. It is true in all worlds for every single team. Thereby, we are prior to opening opposition in the sense that we're not dependent on what memories you are. We're not dependent on you remembering your trauma. We're not dependent on whether or not you memorize as CG says, also your coping mechanism, or not as opening opposition says. At that point, our analysis is one that stands regardless and stands better to government responses than opening opposition's case does. Therefore, proud to stand in closing up.
Thank you very much to Opposition Whip and to all of the speakers from this round. So we can get like a one round of applause. Then we would like to ask the ORCOM to take down the stream and allocate the judges to the judge room. Thank you, everyone, and see you later in the results announcements, which will come up in the closing ceremony.
Thank you.
Thanks so much,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thanks everyone for a really fun